and it should be starting. Now, apologies that we missed the introduction. I could do that again in my own time for the YouTube video. So without further ado, thank you everyone for being here today. We're going to start with a presentation from some of the key authors of the book. I will then use my privileges to ask a few questions as well before we open for the main Q&A. So just bear with me while I share the slides and then we can get started. Right, I'll just make sure. Can everyone see that? Thumbs up if we can, and we'll get going. Perfect. Over to you guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody who's here. We've actually got some of the contributors in the room as well, so you'll get your thanks in a moment. So we're going to give you a brief kind of contextualization of how the collection came together, and I'll pass over to Gina, who will walk you through the key sections and some of the contents and the key kind of takeaways from the book before we open up to some more questions. So as we've already heard, the collection is due out soon. I'm not sure when, Rachel, but soon it'll be available. It's the contemporary issues in transphobic hate and prejudice, transforming the narrative. And the collection, or the kind of editorialship of the collection, came together following an event that Jane and Ben pulled together and held as part of the BSc Hate Crime Network. So we all took part in an event that happened in Bournemouth, and subsequently Ben and Jane brought us together to co-edit this really important collection. Next slide, please, Rachel. So we're really proud of the fact that the collection across the individual chapters brings a really interdisciplinary perspective to the issues of hate experienced by trans people. We address in the individual chapters some really key contemporary issues that trans people are experiencing today, and we focus on the harms beyond the criminal legal framework that a lot of hate studies has previously focused in on around these issues. As I say, the interdisciplinary nature of the collection is one of its real kind of selling points and real facets. It provides a plethora of multidimensional ways of understanding how transphobia operates in contemporary society. And it particularly as well draws upon a really creative range of innovative methods, from life course interviewing through to media analysis, mixed methods approaches. We've got quantitative cross-sectional surveys in there as well. So there's something for everyone in terms of how our chapters are pulled together and how the knowledge that they're based on has been discovered. Thank you, Rachel. So here's the thanks. You can click it again and a thank you, I think, slides in if I've done the slides correctly. Thank you. Thank you to our key contributors. Obviously, the collection couldn't come together. And yes, Ben, Gina, Jane, myself have got chapters individually within the collection, but it wouldn't be what it is without the brilliant work of all of the contributors. So thank you, and thank you to, as I say, some of them I can see in the room. It's really important, and actually lots of early career researchers are in there, people who are more experienced from across the globe as well, bringing really important perspectives to bear on this really important issue. Thanks, Rachel. So the collection arrives at a time that can only be described as a somewhat surging increased attention, focus on trans people as the focus of people's hate and harms that they experience are exacerbated by the environment we find ourselves in. So there is this kind of growing sense of visibility and focus upon trans people, and specifically trans women, but not to say that trans masculine people are not also experiencing the results of the increased scrutiny and harm that is being bestowed upon trans people in contemporary society. Across the world, and emanating particularly from places like the United States, we're seeing the visibility of trans people brought into kind of central focus for all the wrong reasons. This has led to and has pre-existed the environment at the moment, but we have seen a kind of increase in grassroots activism almost in response to what we're experiencing in contemporary society. And there's more kind of cultural conversations around gender diversity taking place, which is positive to see. However, as I say, much of this has been triggered by, emboldened by this parallel surge in transphobia that we are witnessing across the globe. So we have always seen, but particularly continue to see, a rising experience of hostility baked into legal structures, the media, politics, and people's everyday lives. As I say, this is disproportionately being targeted at and focused around trans women's experiences, but non-binary people and transmasculine people are equally impacted and in different ways. And so there is a call for more work to be done to understand the position and experiences of people who exist outside of the kind of media and politics fueled focus on the proposed problem that trans women pose to us in society. Transphobia operates as a structural feature of the present day. It's no longer a kind of legacy issue or something that's in the fringes. What we're seeing is a much more focused attempt, relatively successful attempt by governments and legal structures to centre this issue and become this kind of baked-in structure of defining our contemporary era. Thanks, Rachel. So from a UK perspective, and this is without kind of going through what's happened just in the last week around the Girl Guides and Women's Institute, banning trans women and girls from their groups, post-Cass and the significant Supreme Court ruling in the UK, we have a series of kind of new challenges to trans agency and authenticity and their freedoms and human rights. So there's just, there's just a sum of the examples of what we've seen over the last few years. And even Europe-wide, we're seeing this kind of regression. The UK has been kind of shuffled down the league tables in terms of our position on trans rights, but we can see that across Europe as well. And indeed, we've got Russia, Bulgaria, Hungary imposing complete and total bans on legal gender recognition. So in short, we could sum that up as an unprecedented convergence of legislative hostility, documented violence, and worsening public sentiment towards trans individuals and communities. Thanks, Rachel. So the book leads from the premise that underpins the entire collection, that transphobia functions across multiple levels. We see interactions at interpersonal level, in the everyday kind of mundane reality of lived lives. We also see, though, increasingly examples of hate and harm against trans people being institutionalised in policies and practices. And that's more so in explicitly, whereas previously I would say that it was there implicitly and we could evidence that it's existed for a long time, but more and more we're seeing it being explicitly stated, not helped by the legal positioning that the UK has taken more recently. It occurs at a cultural level as well. We're seeing in the media, say, the public discourse around trans rights to exist, identity, trans lives as a whole being challenged. And as I say, we've seen it baked into the structural legal governance and resource allocation across the UK, Europe, and wider. And at these broader levels, it manifests as a form of organised transphobia, as Amory and Mondon would now term it, seeing it embedded in the policing, the everyday policing, informal and formal, of gender, rigidly baked into medical gatekeeping and indeed in our education systems as well. So we see this collection as a critical intervention really important at this time. Why now? Because of all of these things that we've seen over the course of the last 12 months, but longer. And what the collection does is offers this more expanded set of analytical tools to understand how transphobic hate operates across those different levels, individual, institutional, and structural. And it highlights, therefore, the urgent need for scholarship that documents these harms more fully as they actually exist in lived realities and supports more evidence-based responses to those harms. And by centering trans experiences throughout the collection, it calls for an intersectional justice-driven approach to addressing the harms that we're experiencing and witnessing across the globe for trans people and other gender diverse communities. The key takeaway that runs throughout the collection is the existence of what we term the justice void. So the absolute void, not a place where there is something that could be improved or there is something that is happening that is falling away, as Walters describes in their paper on the justice gap in terms of tracking how cases fall out of the criminal justice system. What we have documented here through the contributions of our authors is an entire complete justice void. So the absence of any justice occurring. It extends beyond that criminal justice focus and captures the much broader, wider injustices that we see outside of those formal systems across culture, politics, society, and digital and physical environments. And now I'll pass you over to Gina to elaborate upon the specific focus of the individual sections.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah, just to give an overview. So we've decided to split the book up into 4 different sections. And each section, we think, really captures both the micro and macro aspects of transphobia, and the different papers are doing different things in terms of exploring those aspects. So I'd like to go, first of all, into section 1, looking at identities and experiences. And again, this captures that kind of mixture of micro and macro. So it examines trans identities. The chapters trace the genealogies of transphobia, some of the history. So to give you some examples, for example, my colleague Ben has a paper in this section which focuses a lot on ambient transphobia, the forms of microaggressions, for example. And then conversely, we have a paper by James Pickles on the emergence of organized transphobia, which is almost, in some ways, it looks like it's the opposite, but in fact, they're interconnected. And then we also have a paper about the experiences and oppressions experienced by young transgender people who are arguably the most targeted of any trans demographic. In terms of having had their rights taken away, their access to gender-affirming care, or even gender-affirming recognition in schools. And we now even have more forms of oppression potentially in terms of social media access. So yeah, those are some really important papers that look at ambient and micro and also macro. If we go to the next section, however, we also look at criminal justice and policy responses. We have we have several types of papers that do different things here. I have a paper which looks at prison abolition and the prison industrial complex, and the complexity of that analysis with the kinds of different arguments and perspectives connected to a large degree, I think, to racism as well. And in that particular paper, I talk about the case of C.C. McDonald in the United States, a trans woman of color who was locked up in a men's prison. Yeah, so I kind of look at the intersectionality of those issues. Other papers in this section include, Amrick's paper on the judiciary and the role of prejudice, for example, in relation to jury stigma and how to overcome that. There's some really interesting solutions that come up in that paper. We have a paper by Eva on Poland, transphobic hate crime in illiberal democracies, and Poland, of course, being one of the more sadly famous examples with its anti-LGBT zones. So Eva's paper really explores the kind of different structural and institutional kind of forces that have created that environment. We also have a paper by, a paper about the situation in Germany. It's like a cross-sectional study, very broad on just societal attitudes towards trans people. So it's very interesting as a comparative piece, I think, to our different analysis of different countries, which happens here. Yeah, I think. Oh yeah, and of course in America we have another study about trans hate crime in the United States from Brendan and Marin. So that's looking at homicides database. So again, we're getting a range of different perspectives on not only things like microaggressions and institutions, but also serious hate crime. Okay, next section, please. Spaces and places. Yeah. So, for example, my colleague Katie has an excellent paper on occupational hazards. So this is on the workplace, which has intensified as a site of hostility for trans people now following the Supreme Court ruling. And I think Katie really deals with these kinds of themes of how it was already not good for trans people and how those forces now have to some degree deteriorated. We have other papers, for example, Martez and Grayson's on doxing. It's a very significant study of the impact of social media and how it has very powerful implications, serious real-world implications, which exit the world of the online and intervene in IRL, in people's actual life. So that's a really significant paper about how the boundaries blur between social media and virtual reality and then in real life. We also have another paper on microaggressions, a very significant kind of area, clearly overlapping with Ben's work. This is by Ioannis, again, on this theme of ambient transphobia. And then the final section, if we go to section 4, media and online discourses. This is one of my academic areas. So we have my study of the Isla Bryson furore of 2023. It's about the trans sex predator narratives that were put on steroids in 2023. It was the year of the party political conferences, and we see how various political bodies, most obviously the Conservatives, really exploited this kind of distorted narrative to vilify trans women and turn them into some kind of boogeyman figure for society, and the impact on trans women as a result. Other papers in this section include Joanna Ashcroft's excellent analysis of, again, online hate, this area which is increasingly just going to become more and more significant. Yeah, Joanna's paper looks in relation to Gender Recognition Act reform from 2018. And but I think this area of online hate is just something that's going to keep on becoming more and more relevant. So that's a very important paper. And finally, we have Jane, our colleague and the fourth member of our team, wrapping things up, talking about the justice void, this key concept about how trans people, like other marginalized minorities, exist almost increasingly in a space where it feels that there is no actual institutional justice, and how do trans people live their lives in such a way. So that completes the 4 sections. And in conclusion, so our book talks about how trans identities are constructed as a threat, as I've already mentioned. and how hate operates in insidious and escalating ways. Insidious meaning, of course, it doesn't need to just be explicit. It can be, oh, concerns. We have concerns for children, so we're going to take away their right to access, for example. It talks about structural individual harms, which reinforce the existence of this justice void we've talked about. We talk about how trans communities are routinely excluded, silenced, ignored, threatened, for example, in media, politics, in the judiciary, in public discourse. And we also have looked at how well, in terms of how trans people are reduced to stereotypes and tropes that deny their individuality, autonomy, safety, and joy. And trans people are often undermined by social, cultural, and political campaigns, portraying them as unworthy of recognition and respect. So these are all very somber conclusions, unfortunately, but very necessary, we think, at this point in time. Okay. However, we also emphasize that it's important trans rights, despite being challenged, eroded, or removed, we might be entering, who knows, a new phase where trans people may be able to push back against this, as they have been already, but we're hoping that this pushback will continue now, and we'll probably get into that in the Q&A. Our collection makes a compelling case for stronger protection, care, and solidarity for trans and non-binary communities. We talk about the foregrounding of the lived experience, dignity, and shared humanity of trans people, and the importance of recognizing that. And our book offers essential analytical tools for understanding how transphobic hate operates across individual, institutional, and structural levels. And I think that's it. So thank you very much for listening to us, and we welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to stop sharing, so give me just a moment so I can see everyone, because that did block my view. Thank you so much for an absolutely fantastic presentation. I think, you know, it's such a timely one, isn't it? And I think often when we're talking about hate crime, we like to think that things are getting better, when in actual fact, in the case of the rights of trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming folk, things are actually getting worse. So thank you to yourselves and the other contributors for such important pieces of research and, you know, challenging and speaking back to that. I'm just going to take a moment to ask a few more questions, which will hopefully help the audience to understand some of these themes a little bit more, and it'll hopefully stimulate some of the discussion later. But I do encourage anyone who has a question to pop it in the chat, and we will come to those in a moment. But just to begin with, you know, as you said, the volume itself spans different identities. It also discusses the repercussions in the policy, in space, and across different discourses as well. After putting this book together, what do you feel are the most urgent gaps? So this might be conceptual, it might be empirical, it could be political, or something else that you think still remain in understanding transphobia today?
So I would be happy to begin answering the question, but because of my own biases and focuses, I'd also welcome my colleagues then bringing in their own insights. But for me personally, I mean, we've just gone through the week or a couple of weeks now where we've had a series of exclusionary decisions by, as has already been said, Girl Guiding, Women's Institute, Labour Women's Conference. But equally, we had the Sandy Peggy case, which the decision, I believe it just came out yesterday, which I've been following addictively on social media. And it's been interesting to see how the media have been pushing this blanket ban narrative and narratives that vilify trans people in order to justify it. But we've also seen the limits of it, because the case was really about the perceived kind of status of Dr. Beth Upton, who'd been absolutely monstered in the press, and about how she'd, by her very presence in women-only spaces, specifically changing rooms, was a form of harassment. And actually, she was innocent of all accusations. And the court decision or statement was that actually it's not illegal for trans women necessarily to be in women-only spaces. So we've had this narrative by the media for since the Supreme Court ruling saying, right, we have to ban all trans people. And those that have been following the law know that the Supreme Court ruling didn't say this. So now are we entering this new phase where the hubris of the anti-trans lobby groups and the media are beginning to get stuck in this new reality where, in terms of the law, it's not so simple. You can't just strip away trans people's human rights in this way. And so in terms of this new phase, potentially, I remember the Good Law Project, for example, saying, have they actually finally overreached? Has the anti-trans movement overreached with the Supreme Court ruling? Because now it's so transparent that they want to erase trans people from public spaces. Are the media going to begin to step back and say, okay, we've taken this hatred and exclusion as far as we can take it. Now we're hitting up against this wall. So it would be interesting from a media scholar's perspective to see how the media coverage changes, whether it changes, whether the activities of anti-trans lobby groups will change, whether increasingly institutions begin to have more confidence in supporting trans people and their inclusion. I get the feeling that perhaps something is going to change as a result of this case, although of course it will be appealed. But I feel like perhaps the anti-trans movement in Britain may have gone as far as it could go, and that will be interesting to analyze from a media perspective. And related to this, the strategic litigation campaigns that have been dominating Britain increasingly since 2021, when gender critical beliefs were given protected beliefs. So from a legal perspective, I think the issue of strategic litigation, keeping tabs on this and seeing what's going to happen now in this new phase, when it's obvious that what the Supreme Court ruling was saying wasn't necessarily a blanket ban. So that's from a media perspective, but I welcome Katie, Ben, and Jane adding their thoughts to the gaps that are there.
Okay, I'll jump in. Yeah, I think in terms of gaps, and I guess where I'd like to see kind of more research is looking at how do we effectively engage in kind of community building, particularly looking at those kind of spaces and communities that we would like to think are inclusive, but are not. So particularly looking at kind of spaces that might label themselves as kind of queer spaces, but are actually very much dominated by cisgender white gay men, and actually the levels of kind of trans misogyny, racism within those spaces. Actually, how do we effectively community build within those spaces? So yeah, so I think one of the areas that I would like to look at is relationships within kind of broader LGBTQI plus kind of communities. I think quite often we talk about hate, and we always kind of locate power outside of those groups. But actually there's huge complex power relations within these groups as well that I think sometimes kind of get overlooked. So yeah, so I think for me that's where I would like to see research go.
I absolutely agree, Ben. I mentioned earlier, I think that the absence of more research around the lived experience of transmasculine people is really important. It's so dominated by this, fascination with trans women, and there's a real absence, a lack in the research that's really elaborating on and exploring the lived realities for people who are transmasculine.
And just to add, I agree with all of my colleagues there, but I think for me, I would like to see more legislative change, because I think with positive legislation will establish those societal boundaries in which we can exist and work and live safely. And I think in the UK, the current Labour government should deliver on its manifesto for hate crime legislation, and that should incorporate our trans communities as it currently does in our disparate legislation. And I think that would be a really powerful symbolic message for the UK to take a stand on that. So I would really like to see that delivered.
And sorry, can I just add, having listened to those responses as well, yeah, because I just wanted to agree with that. First of all, talking about non-binary identities, so we saw the kind of overturning of the status of non-binary identity as being included in gender reassignment as a protected characteristic. Because we all thought after Taylor versus Jaguar Land Rover, which is around 2020, that non-binary was included, and then a court case just a few months ago overruled that, I think in relation to the Supreme Court ruling. So I think it's important now to like have plenty of research which looks at the harassment and hate that non-binary people suffer, so that we understand at a national level the consequences of non-binary people not having that kind of protection and status.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you all. I think, you've captured a range of areas that we actually really need to work on, and thinking about the role of the media and legislation. I really like that point about community building in an age of disinformation, misinformation, of power, hierarchy, and thinking about what inclusion means, both in terms of activism and community building and in research. But shifting slightly now, I'm thinking about some of the chapters within the edited collection. So several of your chapters, as you've already said, highlight how transphobia is reinforced through various different institutions. So a couple of the ones you mentioned were prisons, workplaces, and courts. But based on the research in this book, what kind of institutional or structural changes do you believe would make the most meaningful difference to trans people's safety and well-being?
I'll start with this one. I think I can propose a long list of things that would be nice if we could try and get, and I'll agree with Jane, if we could get legislation that actually is implemented and means something on the ground, it would be a good start. I think that's really problematic. A lot of what the book explores is that there is, maybe well-meaning legislation that's been laid down over the last couple of decades now, but it's existed, but still the lived reality is that it's not actually served as protecting trans people from the experiences that are their lived reality on a day-to-day basis in all of these spaces. So that's a challenge, and there's potential there. So sticking with the criminal justice system for a bit, you might say that we need to make sure that we actually do expand. There's been a lot of conversation about expanding the hate crime frameworks and hate studies frameworks to make sure that we are actually properly acknowledging things that sit outside of kind of physical, interpersonal, violent expressions of hate, and understanding that those lived realities is much more nuanced. So that's one thing that we could seek to do. One of the chapters that we've mentioned already, the reformation of the jury selection process to ensure that LGBTQ plus representation is a reality. End this protective solitary confinement for trans prisoners as any kind of workable solution to the practical challenges of prison estates. Guaranteeing housing that aligns with people's gender identity. In the employment space, we could do with, I feel, returning to the idea that gender critical beliefs can operate as workplace discrimination in reality. We can make more mandatory organisational accountability for the experiences of all their employees, perhaps with financial penalties, as is the only thing that really means anything to any organisation in the current environment. In terms of digital harms, definitely the legal recognition of the experience of doxing that our contributors have explained, more platform accountability. We feel like we may be moving towards that, but as things kind of advance at the same pace, more rapidly than legislative reforms take place, we'll see if that actually has the effect that it's intended. Development of those accountability frameworks for digital platforms. Media regulation always needs to be on there. So preventing this, what Gina's just explained already, this conflation of kind of individual moments with entire communities, and the focus on some court case results versus the absence of others that exist in the same space would be helpful. In healthcare, and legal recognition, reversing this painful policy of puberty blocking ban for young people, that we're seeing evidence already now that that's going to cause real danger, harm to young people. Those of us who work in this area, that won't be a surprise to, but the fact that this has happened despite the fact that that knowledge and experience has been relayed is problematic. But there's kind of a fundamental contradiction in all of it, isn't there? Is that we're talking about, it would be nice if we could make some of these adjustments within these systems, that actually the book does a really good job of laying out how actually these systems are doing exactly what they're designed to do. And we possibly might, I would suggest, need to take a more radical perspective of how do we, as Ben was alluding to, support communities to organise together to create community that's actually doing what we need our communities to do, aside from those institutions that I fear, without being too depressing, we don't have much hope of them actually making the changes that will have the real effect on people's lives. The world is a rapidly changing place. AI, the era of Trump, climate crisis, the world is about to even more so rapidly unravel, and perhaps we could take that as an opportunity to say, actually, now is the time to do something more radical, and perhaps if we can summon the energy amongst us, we can do that together. So there's a list and a challenge.
I think that's very comprehensive, and we probably have nothing to add to that one. I don't know about my colleagues, but I've nothing further to add to that.
Yeah, I thought that was fantastic, and I like that balance, like you said, between sort of a wish list of things we need and the challenge as well. I think that's important. And I think, Gina, you spoke, actually it might be yourself, Katie, my memory is now failing, but you spoke about the international contributions, so people from Poland, Germany, the USA also contributing to this book in terms of the state of affairs within their own countries. And I wondered what stood out to you about how transphobic hate manifests differently across these different national contexts. And do you think that these differences, indeed, if there are any, reveal something about the global patterns of how we're seeing transphobia manifest?
Well, I'll have a go at that, Rachel, if that's all right. I meant to say earlier that I really wanted to thank the publishers as well for publishing this book, because we've got our authors, but it's really important to thank Routledge for taking on this collection, and everyone within the Routledge team has been really supportive of it, which is very encouraging for us as well, working in this space. So as you mentioned, there are global perspectives in the book, so we've got the various chapters, and in some of the chapters we talk about some of the really positive developments for trans communities in some areas, such as in Germany with self-identification legislation, Finland and Spain and Sweden, but also balancing that with Russia, Bulgaria, Hungary, the US, of course, the issues as Katie and Gina have talked about here in the UK as well. So I think for us, it's less about manifesting different types of hate in different countries, but more about those different cultures, those that have specifically sort of trans exclusionary policies having a much more upfront and aggressive approach to how they treat their trans communities, and those that are more inclusive in their legislation still having that insidious discriminatory practice, but it's much more elusive and more difficult to negotiate and to identify. And then, of course, there's different manifestations in terms of the online abuse that we document in the book as well. So I think, yeah, the legislative environments can embolden and prohibit some actions. And I think what we're trying to say, I guess, is that although some states have better responses, better laws, better reporting measures, it's the perniciousness of the sort of anti-trans sentiments that destabilizes those attempts at positivity and inclusion, and concurrently then adds and increases or decreases effectively confidence in reporting. So even in positive environments, we know not everybody's going to report what's happening to them. And some of the chapters for me also highlighted the intersectionality, as Gina said, of experiences for trans people. And I don't think that was particularly specific to a country or a nation, but again, comes back to that sort of cultural and institutional landscape that's presented. So, you know, the chapter that talked about homeless trans women who work as sex workers being incredibly high risk is a combination or an intersection of, you know, devaluing and lack of opportunity in paid employment, in safe employment, in safe accommodation that's driving people into these high risk, high harm environments. And I think what's most concerning for me is this lack of public empathy that goes alongside it, and that has a, you know, a big impact. But I'll stop talking because I'm looking at the clock. Sorry. You can tell we really enjoy this collection and talking about it.
Yeah, I think that passion is really important. I think that point at the end about public empathy, I think that is such an important one in terms of what can be done and what I guess isn't being doing to resolve this right now. As you mentioned, Jane, I'm also conscious of time. I do have more questions, but I did want to open up to the audience for a moment as well, in case anyone else had a question. You can pop it in the chat. You can pop up your physical and or virtual hand and we can unmute you if you have one. If not, I will continue to take chair privileges and ask more questions, but I wanted to give everyone else a moment if they had any. And I do encourage everyone to access this book when it is out as well. Just give everyone a moment.
I think we're working to a May deadline, isn't that right, Ben, for publishing?
I think it begins with an M, but I think it might be March.
Oh, March.
I think we're going for a publication date of March.
Sooner.
Yeah.
Super.
Well, we'll be able to share it through the BSc Hate Crime Network, obviously through the authors as well, so everyone will be able to access that. While everyone's thinking about some questions, then I will ask another, if that is okay. I think it's something that you've actually all touched upon, which is, I guess, and it's a tension that I've held within my own work, is that tension between visibility and uplifting and platforming LGBTQ+ and trans individuals, which we know is so important, and then the inherent vulnerability within that from the backlash and hostility that is faced by these communities. So I guess my question is, how do you think, whether we as researchers or practitioners or just community members and allies, how do we navigate this tension ethically when we're representing trans people? And I think this actually spills across to other marginalised groups as well.
Yeah, okay, I'll take this one. So yeah, I think you know, visibility and vulnerability are two kind of key areas that come out across lots of chapters in the book. And yeah, I'd agree. For me as a researcher, I think that's one of the kind of central ethical challenges in terms of research with trans communities, particularly because I think visibility can both kind of empower but also expose at the same time, whereas kind of invisibility can both protect but also simultaneously erase at the same time. And so I think in terms of the actual research process, I think as researchers, people need to begin to prioritize kind of process consent rather than one-time consent. So, you know, I think traditional kind of one-off consent, you sign a consent form to take part in this, is kind of poorly suited to working with kind of any marginalized group whose actual risks of exposure, of violence, of victimization will actually fluctuate rather than kind of be static. And so using kind of ongoing revisitable consent where we can check in kind of throughout the research process kind of respects that vulnerability is kind of context dependent and not fixed at the time of signing a form. I think co-producing representation is really, really important. So looking at the involvement of communities, whether it's the individuals, advisory boards, in terms of the implementation of a research project, designing questions, interpreting data, and then also kind of when you write up, you know, sending back to kind of check that, you know, this is actually what was meant. But then in terms of kind of data and looking at that, I think we need to separate the value of data from the visibility of the contributor. And so I don't think, trans people or any marginalized group should have to be visible for their experiences to kind of matter. And so for me, it's about distinguishing between kind of individual visibility, which might carry risk, and issue visibility, which can kind of drive positive change. And so I think a part of that is also normalizing the legitimacy of non-visibility. And so actually some people may prefer invisibility. And this should be treated not as a loss, but as a kind of ethical choice, and recognizing that non-visibility can be protective and a protective stance rather than a kind of failure to participate. And so I think that is about finding ways to provide avenues for contribution that don't require that kind of personal visibility. So yeah, those are a couple of things I think that we could do to help kind of balance that tension.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. I don't know if anyone else had anything to add, but I love how you summarised that, the idea of process consent, not one-off consent, and then what else did you say? Individual visibility and issue visibility. I like the conciseness of that. I think that's really important. Katie, did you want to add something?
Yeah,
or Jane?
I absolutely agree. I called it iterative consent when I was doing my PhD. I remember, and that was a really distinct part of the ethical kind of heart of research, is not just assuming. And if you've developed a relationship well and done it right, actually you often find that people have shared much more by the end of the process than perhaps they'd even thought that they were going to. So making sure that everybody's okay with kind of everything that's been shared, and that's a really important part of the process. I've forgotten I was going to make another point, but it's gone out of my head because that's the way they do. They come in and go out again. I'll come back if it pops back in, sorry.
No, I was going to agree entirely as well. And I think this speaks to the nature of having varied methodologies in the book. For us as predominantly qualitative researchers, that process of consent and participation takes so much longer to nurture, to develop, to really feel that you're engaging with your participants and they feel informed all through the process. And that differs enormously to some of our other chapters where, they're looking at national data sets or analysing survey data. And it raises the question of to what extent is consent there in those different formats as well. But yeah, Ben, I think Ben's on a runner for another book there in terms of what he was saying. Methodology's next.
Yeah, part 2, look out. Did anyone else in the audience have a question?
You've got a Q&A. Can you see that, Rachel?
Fantastic. One has come through. This suddenly started working, so that's brilliant. Sorry, Vera, you have asked a question. So my apologies. I should get better at chairing this. So the question says, thank you for this talk. It sounds like a fantastic book. How do you go about producing an academic book and the timeline that this entails in a climate where there are constant legal and political developments?
Okay, yeah, I guess for us it's one of those that the collection has to come at a certain point, and I think for us when there are constant developments, even just in the last couple of weeks, the book has now been kind of finalized, it's in production, and since we've kind of finalized proofs, there's been the Women's Institute's Girls Guidance, Angie Peggy, all of these constant developments that I don't think you can necessarily pin down. I don't think we would be able to go, well, actually, if we publish this in 12 months time, all of these developments will have stopped and we can give a really good overview. So I think it is just actually do the academic book, and I think the constant developments will just reinforce the need that this is not the only book that will be needed. There is scope and there is definitely space that we are going to need future kind of publications because there is so much kind of social change. Yeah, I guess in terms of timeline, I guess we started talking about this in 2023, I think towards the end of 2023. So it is quite a long timeline in terms of, you know, starting that initial idea and a proposal into getting a final book kind of published. I guess we're going to be looking at kind of 2.5 years from the kind of initial proposal and idea. But yes, that would be my advice, is just, you know, if you're looking at an academic book, I don't think there's ever a right time to do it. Do it.
Yeah, great advice there. And thanks, Vera, for your really kind comments there. I totally agree with Ben, and I think what's really important is the buy-in from the publishers as well, that they, you know, as much as there's been legal and political change and not a lot of it not good, we still have a publisher on board that wants to publish the book and sees the value in highlighting research in this field. And I don't work for a publisher. I'm just putting that out there. So I think it is about finding the right partner to work on a book with. But as Ben says, it's a bit like your PhD. The moment it's signed off and published, then you're like, oh, someone else produces something a week later. So it's always going to change. And I hope that this book creates more of that conversation for change and flags up the breadth of issues in this. I mean, it's comprehensive in terms of the extent of harm and discrimination and violence and murders in some of the chapters, which is not an easy read, but is for us very important to talk about and hopefully do something about.
I just wanted to add onto the end there, as well as the publishers, supportive publishers, it's been really key having a supportive, collaborative, collegiate kind of team of editors. There's not every corner of academia is known for kind of working together and supporting each other, and it's been a really important part for me, at least, this process, because it's hard for all sorts of reasons. You know, our work in criminology is never particularly joyous. So to kind of tackle some of these really important issues together and know that we're all there on the same, you know, you're working with people who share your concerns and kind of hopes for making a difference is really important as well.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's probably a perfect place to bring this to a close. Thank you for such an important question from Vera as well. And thank you to yourselves and the other contributors for putting this book together. I know, like you just said, it's a really hard-hitting topic, and it's a topic that right now is, while it shouldn't be, very contentious. It's harming real lives, isn't it? So thank you for doing your piece of work to help support the trans, non-binary and gender non-conforming communities. And thank you to everyone who came along today to engage with this. Keep a lookout for the book in March and/or May, one of the ends of 2026, and continue the good work as well within our own circles, whether that's in academia or in the activism in our day-to-day lives. So yes, thank you again, everyone, for coming, and for yourselves for your contributions today.
Thanks for having us, Rachel.
Thank you.
And being a wonderful one.
Thank you. You got that in just at the end of the recording.